There's a story that Kathy, our friend Kathy, was here the other day, and the story that she told me that I found inspiring, and I'll probably relate it incorrectly, but it was a very good story, so I'll try to relate it anyway. It was that there was one of these Dhamma practitioners, and she's Native American, and so one of the issues that comes up sometimes when we start to try to understand Dhamma vocabulary and Dhamma words in different languages, and so trying to translate certain words into different languages, and so trying to translate the word for enlightenment or liberation into this Native American language, and not really knowing how to do it. Most languages, when you take a word like that, it'll have to be a compound or a number of words. And for example, talking with Ajahn Sudanto the other day, the word viveka, we translate that as solitude, and that seems to capture the energy of it well enough in English, viveka. But then to translate viveka into another language like Thai or Chinese or Japanese is quite difficult. And in Thai, they actually don't even translate it. They just use the word vivek, which is just viveka. They just use that word, and they have a feeling for that. But to explain that in Thai takes a lengthy explanation, and then to translate that into Chinese or Japanese is difficult. You can't just translate the word solitude from English, say, into Japanese. It doesn't sound very good. It doesn't capture the energy of it. So trying to translate the word for enlightenment or liberation into this Native American language, whatever language that was, there was Navajo or Lakota, I'm not sure exactly which language it was, but not knowing how to translate it because a straight translation, there was no way to do that. So she informed her tribe and asked them, how do you translate this? And the elders also this particular elder didn't know the translation. So they decided that they would call a council meeting and discuss how to translate this word, so liberation. And they're like, well, can you describe it for us? And so, well, okay, it's you're completely free, bright, trying to describe the different qualities of liberation: calm, not suffering, peaceful, and there's a sense of just being completely free, open, and content. And so there's all these qualities. So, okay. And so they had a discussion, and they said, well, okay, we'll let you know what we come up with. So they had a council meeting about it. And it was a few days, and they discussed it and went back and forth. And then they came back to her after a few days, and they said, okay, this elder said, okay, well, we found the word for it. We found the translation. And she said, oh, what is it? And he said, normal. And the word we came up with is normal. I'm tempted to end the Dhamma talk. But yeah, I thought that's what you come up with in trying to translate something into another language, and sometimes that's the way to learn Dhamma. So I didn't really feel like I understood Dhamma deeply until I lived in Thailand and understood translations of different things in Thai. Then I felt I could understand it more deeply, and trying to see what these various terms and words are actually pointing toward. But what I told Kathy then was, that's interesting because a lot of the Kruba Ajahns say that you're supposed to try to keep your mind in a state of normalcy, and that's how you're practicing correctly. So there's this sense of wanting to do some sort of spiritual athletics, wanting to do something extreme, sitter's practice, go without sleep, go without eating. So we term that as spiritual athletics. And we want to do something that's some sort of like, that we can point to as like a spiritual achievement, something external, that I did this for so and so many days. I did a retreat for 30 days. I did a retreat for 60 days. I did a retreat for 100 days. Something we can put on our spiritual resume. But then that doesn't mean anything, actually. It doesn't. What means something is normal. Just if we're mindful for 1 minute, we're not crazy for 1 minute. So if we're mindful for 1 day, we're not crazy for 1 day. So that's the teaching of Luang Por Cha, saying that when there's no mindfulness, it's like you're crazy. So we can equate mindfulness with a state of normality or a state of normalcy. So this is very important. That's remember Ajahn Ñāṇiko talking about Luang Por Liam, how he went to Luang Por Liam. Because Ajahn Ñāṇiko didn't ordain at Wat Pah Pong, he actually ordained at a different monastery in Yasothon. And he only went to Luang Por Liam after, I think he might have been 3 or 4 vasas by the time he went to Wat Nong Pah Pong. And one of the Ajahns, the Ajahn that he ordained with, was very strict and diligent. He had certain techniques that you had to do and that he was espousing. And then he ended up disrobing. And then he went to another Ajahn, and he was quite drawn to this other Ajahn because he was really into psychic powers. And so he really thought, well, this Ajahn must be really good because he's really into psychic powers. And then he disrobed. And then he went to some other Ajahn who was impressive in some way. And then I think he even disrobed as well. And so then he decided to go to Wat Pah Pong. And then he went to Luang Por Liam. And the thing about Luang Por Liam was he wasn't impressive. So he's kind of like, well, this is unusual. Like, this monk is not impressive. But there's something there. So he went to live at Wat Pah Pong and take dependence under Luang Por Liam and stayed. And Luang Por Liam didn't disrobe. And the thing about Luang Por Liam was then it's like completely ordinary, and that's the way to be. That's the hardest thing to do. So we want something We want the psychic powers. We want something to be extra lucky, extra auspicious. We want some sort of something to point to say, like, this is extraordinary, this is amazing. But what ended up being amazing about Luang Por Liam was his ordinariness. So he's like extraordinarily ordinary, and literally an old monk picking up sticks in the forest, and just that was what ended up being what was the Dhamma. But then over time, later on, noticing things that he wasn't suffering, that was unusual. But you can only notice that over a long period of time, that there was no suffering, there was no anxiety, completely at ease, and whether he was sitting, walking, standing, lying down, completely at ease, no suffering. We had a very good midnight tea discussion, probably one of the record long midnight teas, almost 2 hours last night. And one of the parts of that discussion was the way we confound ourselves by trying to kind of say, like, well, isn't, trying to make the Dhamma kind of vague, or like, well, isn't this all just totally, Four Noble Truths is uncertain, maybe it's not that way, or trying to say, like, well, use our intellect to confound our understanding of the Dhamma. So I remember someone went to Luang Por Liam and said they were suffering a lot, and they had kind of these different ideas about arhants and Buddhas, and said, well, didn't the Buddha suffer? Didn't the Buddha suffer? He had to suffer too, so it's okay if we suffer. And then Luang Por Liam said, no, that was the thing that was different about the Buddha. He wasn't suffering. He didn't suffer. Once he was Buddha, there was no suffering ever again. So that's what we're aiming for. So it's very difficult to be normal. It's very difficult to be... When we think of normal, usually it's like normal according to the societal norms, normal according to the TV shows we watch and how we're shown to act according to what we let in, according to whatever trends are in society. So that, in that sense, normal is always changing. But in Dhamma, in the timeless Dhamma, the normal is not suffering. And then we're true to our own nature. We're normal within our own nature, however that may be. Normal according to the society, it's always changing. And things that were normal in the 1700s would seem really weird, really strange now. And people 300, 400 years ago wouldn't be able to conceive of even how we are now, how we dress, how we act. It was considered, in the 1700s, apparently it was considered very manly for men to wear tights and weird-looking shoes with points on the tips, and strange kind of like cummerbunds and ruffled shirts, things that would just seem totally ridiculous, but men at that time would strut around wearing such things and be considered very manly and attractive, even. If we saw somebody doing that now, it would just burst out laughing. It would just be ridiculous. But then anybody through through history. If, according to the Dhamma, then not suffering, that's normal, that's desirable. So then, how do we not suffer? So we seem to keep running up against this. We keep suffering. We keep suffering. And we keep suffering, and we keep suffering. It never stops. And unless we get the Sila Samadhi Panya, and when we have the Sila Samadhi Panya, and we know anicca, dukkha, anatta, then we can start to unravel. We can start to unravel the tangle of samsara, of the cycle, the endless cycle of suffering and dissatisfaction, and disease, discontent, and sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, the whole mass of suffering. Start to see why the Buddha talked in certain ways in the suttas, and we'll find ourselves starting to repeat the way the suttas speak, because that's the way of non-suffering. Luang Por Sumedho defined Nibbana as the reality of non-suffering. It's quite a profound definition. So when we know anicca, dukkha, anatta, and the truths peculiar to the Buddhas, the Four Noble Truths, the dukkha, the causa dukkha, cessation of dukkha, and the path. This is totally, absolutely vital information. And it's not secret, it's out there. We just have to realize it. We have to contemplate it, see it for what it is, realize it, internalize it, study it, get to know it in ourselves. The Four Noble Truths is just a framework for looking at our own experience. So when we look at our own experience in terms of dukkha, looking at that First Noble Truth, is it true? Are we suffering? Is there any sense of dissatisfaction? Is there any sense of something not quite right? Is there sorrow? Is there, just using California speak, are we in a big bummer? Is it bummer time? That's dukkha. So we could translate dukkha as bummer. Bummer dude. That's dukkha. So is that how it is? And then the second noble truth, the cause, desire, and it's so simple and straightforward. It's so simple and straightforward just to say that desire is the cause of dukkha, but then to see it is incredibly difficult, because there's something deep inside in the heart which is telling us that desire is the way to happiness. It's flipped on its head. We're seeing things with sanya vipallasa. That's what the Buddha said. The perception is flipped over. So one translation of sanya vipallasa is derangement of perception. So if there's not that seeing of dukkha, and we come back to that idea of not having sati, not having mindfulness, and being like a crazy person, we could also think of if we don't see desire as the cause of dukkha, then we're deranged. And it's like these owls that Tan Rakito just made. I don't know if anybody saw them. They have. There's one. I walked into the workshop and I saw this owl that Tan Rakito had made, and it had a beak and eyes made out of copper. So it was like the shape of an owl cut out of plywood, and the beak and eyes were made out of little pieces of scrap copper, and one eye was kind of lower than the other eye, And then he used a Sharpie pen to kind of trace owl markings around the eyes, and it looked quite deranged. And I thought, well, the woodpeckers are going to be scared of that owl because you don't know what he's going to do. Like, he's a deranged owl. And so that's kind of that image. We can bring that image to mind in terms of sanya vipalasa, the derangement of perception. And so, but the cause of dukkha, and then we're suffering, and then when we investigate our suffering, we think, what is this coming from? And it's always, okay, it's coming from something outside. I need to change this person. I need to change this situation. But then if we look really deeply, then we look at tanha, the desire, and say, oh, wow, the Buddha was actually right. It's actually coming from tanha. It's actually coming from desire. Desire for things to not be the way they are. That's vibhava tanha. Desire to get something, for something to be a certain way. That's bhava tanha. Or just desire for sense pleasures. That's the kama tanha. So we start to see, oh, that's the desire. That's the desire. And then we come to there's the realization that we don't have the third noble truth yet. We don't see that ending of suffering, or we might see it temporarily, but we have the path. So the path to seeing these things more clearly and to unraveling the whole mass of dukkha. Buddha also talks this way in terms of dependent origination. We come to an end of this whole mass of suffering. And if we think in terms of time, it really is a mass of suffering. It's just suffering upon suffering upon suffering. It's just think of how many tears we've shed in just this life alone. And the Buddha says in all of our past lives we've shed more tears than was in the whole ocean. And just for a second, just try to imagine how much you would have to cry to fill up the whole ocean. He said we've cried even more than that if we add up all of our past lives. And so the Buddha says, hasn't it been enough? Haven't you cried enough yet? When are you going to decide that you've cried enough? Or all of your bones from all of your past lives being more than the whole earth. So when have you had enough bones? When have you shed enough bodies, been through enough rebirths to come to that decision? We've just been through this according to the Buddha's teaching, and so we can't there's almost nobody who can see their past lives. That's a psychic power that could be developed, but if we take it on faith, then we think, well, we've just been through this so many times before. There was one Kruba Ajahn, I think it might have been Luang Por Liam, when he was here, we were asking him about past lives, and he said, or specifically asking, like, why can't we see our past lives? Why isn't it just like a memory? Like, why can't I remember just being born, and then before that in past life, why isn't it just ordinary to remember that kind of thing? He said that the reason you don't remember is because when you die, it's very traumatic usually, and based on that trauma, the citta has a thing where it shuts it off, and you can't, unless you truly overcome all fear of death, it's very difficult to push the mind back in that way. So he said that's why most of us can't remember our past lives. It's just because there's that mental trauma in the citta that it can't recall. And birth is also traumatic. So there's not just the death, but then there's the whole terror involved in the rebirth process, the chitta being blown about by the hot winds of kama, and then entering into a new rebirth, whatever state that might be in, is whether it was as an animal or whatever realm, and then into this life as a ghost, into this life as a human rebirth, into a human womb, and then the traumatic experience of being born. Science even says that being born is the most traumatic experience a human experiences in this life. So the trauma of rebirth. And so most of us can't remember that either. It's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but there's a Tibetan text I really like, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand by Pabonka Rinpoche, and he talks about, I particularly like his teachings on karma and rebirth, and also the contemplations of the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death. And he goes into detail on these different sufferings and how to contemplate these different forms of human suffering in order to become dispassionate to them. And there's also, he talks about this contemplation, and it comes up in the suttas as well, that it's hard to find any being anywhere of any realm that was not once your mother. And this is used as a cultivation of compassion. It's hard to find a being anywhere that has not been your mother at some point in the realms of all of our rebirths. Then it's hard to find any being, whether it's an insect or any of you or whatever. Hard to find anyone who's never has not at some point been our mother. So then and then remembering the kindness our mother in this life may have shown us, and trying to extend that to all beings and view them all in the same way. And so he says that sometimes people object to this teaching. And when they object to this teaching, they say, well, surely if someone was my mother in any of my past lives, I would really see them as such. I would really remember that. And then he said, well, some people don't even recognize their mothers in this life. So how can you remember your mother in a past life? Some people, they may have been separated from their mother early on or something like that, and they don't even recognize their mother in this life. So there's this lack of recognition, or this lack of remembering. And so again, we take these teachings on faith. But they're there, those teachings are there, and they're interesting. So we take these on as a contemplation of dukkha, how to see dukkha, how to understand it, how to fully understand it, and how to be free from it, therefore be normal and at ease. So I'll leave that as a few thoughts for this evening. We'll end with the verses on well-being, page 41.
From liberty, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may they maintain well-being in themselves. May all beings be released from all suffering, and may they not be parted from the good fortune they have attained. When they act upon intention, all beings are the owners of their action and inherit its results. Their future is born from such action, companion to such action,